Welcome to the SMA podcast series, A Day in the Life, a publication of the Southern Medical Association's Physicians in Training Leadership Working Group, composed of medical students and residents, whose mission is to provide a forum to plan and design new educational activities for physicians in training.
Today, we are joined by Carissa Anthony, the Prevention and Development Coordinator with the Safe and Healthy Homewood Coalition in Homewood, Alabama. She will be discussing alcohol and drug prevention in youth, as well as sharing how the risk and protective factors for drugs and alcohol are also the same factors for suicide, teen pregnancy, mental health struggles, and juvenile delinquency. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Jennifer. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you, and I'm very much looking forward to speaking to your audience and sharing information on youth prevention. In my role, I do work with youth. One of my primary focuses is on preventing drug and alcohol use, but also we know that the same risk factors apply to preventing suicide, teen pregnancy, mental health struggles that youth may face, as well as juvenile delinquency. So in my role as a prevention educator, I oftentimes really look to more the medical model of being able to identify what are those key risk factors and how do we have a positive impact with negating or preventing as many of the risk factors as possible, while at the same time looking at those protective factors and how do we increase those protective factors in children, in families, in schools, and in the community at large.
This is going to be a very informative discussion, and as we get started, why don't we begin with what exactly is prevention?
Jennifer, I would say prevention, and in this response, I'm really just going to focus on drug and alcohol prevention among youth. So prevention really focuses on how can we build in protective factors for children, thinking about all the different domains of our society that touch children. So we want to think about how do we build protective factors in the family unit? How do we build protective factors for the individual, but also among their peers? Building those protective factors in the community so that the community is positive and supporting so that children can make healthy choices, and they've got a lot of role models that are very pro-social and positive in not using substances. So we kind of think of prevention in terms of building the support network around children in the community where they live and the family where they live, the school they attend, the community organizations and groups that they might be involved in.
In your experience, why do youth use substances?
In my experience, youth substance use really, and the reasons why, I kind of boil down to three really broad reasons. And I've kind of done this with a lot of different groups and trainings where I'll ask people, why do you think youth use, and why did you use, or why did your peers use when you were growing up? And it just never fails. It can really fall into those, no matter what the reason is, they can really fall into one of those three broad categories. So the first one is oftentimes youth will turn to substances as a way of dealing with difficult emotions. For us, it's hard to say, okay, well, how do we fix that with children? Because we certainly can't keep them in a bubble and keep them from ever experiencing difficult emotions. But what we can do is really just be there for them. A lot as a caring adult, whether you're a parent or whether you're, have another relationship with a young person, is being available and being accepting and just listening to them. You don't necessarily have to be able to fix their situation or fix their problem. The other thing we can do as positive adults in their life is help them develop some, positive coping skills. Helping them learn things that make their life better, help them, might be deep breathing exercises or relaxation. Sometimes it's also just in talking to them, you may find that they have what we kind of call some cognitive distortions where they have like all or none thinking, everybody does this or everybody got invited, I'm the only one that didn't. Whatever might be going on, that all or none thinking, we can kind of help them to think, is that really reality? other things that we can do as caring adults, whether it's, like I said, as a parent or another way that you're connected with young people, is to encourage, adequate sleep. Our children are probably more sleep deprived than I think they've ever been. And that when you're sleep deprived, it's more difficult to deal with emotions. It's more difficult to deal with life. Other positive activities such as exercise, time management, keeping a planner, knowing what you need to do, limiting your screen time so that you actually are able to accomplish the important things that you need to accomplish before you get on Netflix or get on Instagram or Snapchat or anything. Those are all things that we can do that help children cope with emotions and cope with their life better. And in some cases, it may be that the situation, their mental health concerns or issues or struggles really do require professional help. And I think that's, we should be willing to reach out and get them professional help when we need to.
Going back to something you just said, if you don't mind, the screen time and limiting those kinds of things, do you feel that the video games and that we have sort of largely become a 24-hour online society is playing into some of this, and just we feel we must be connected to our phones and to our video games and to everything, and we need to take steps and make efforts to kind of separate from those, just like you said, go out, get some exercise and work on time management, things like that.
Oh, completely. I think the opportunity for distraction into endeavors or into an online world that is a complete waste of time is just so readily available to most of our children, and it's a tough thing to resist. It is so attractive. It's personally, I would probably much rather play a video game than do laundry. I mean, I can think of a lot of things I'd rather do. I'd rather watch Netflix. I would rather do all of those things than clean the kitchen or whatever it is. So you can definitely understand how parents really do have to set those limits, because young people, although they make, I'm always surprised with what great decisions teens make most of the time. I mean, most of them make pretty good decisions most of the time, but they're not really ready to have that degree of freedom to just have unlimited access to things like that, to media and stuff, because it's too hard. It's too hard to on your own manage that if you're a teenager. So they really need us as parents to.
And as an adult, it can be difficult. So you can imagine as a teenager and as you head in from adolescence to teens, and even, I'm the parent of a 20-year-old, and, he even we've had to have the time management and when to disengage from the electronics and doing other things and what you have to do versus what you want to do. So it's a struggle.
It is, and I'm glad you point out it is a struggle for all of us, and youth really do need help in that, because they're just not quite ready to have complete freedom in that domain. And as I said, there are really three broad reasons of youth substance use, and I'll kind of touch back on a little bit on the media in this next example, because the next example is, or next broad category of why youth use, is to try to fit in socially and to connect with social groups. And, most of us remember from, Psychology 101 about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and belongingness is, one of those basic needs. So we're all created as human beings. I mean, we want to be a part of a social group. It's a need we have universally. And, young people today, I think, find it more natural to connect over media platforms than necessarily to connect person to person. Now, some do that great, but I'm just seeing more of that they're more comfortable connecting on media platforms than in person. So I think that's something we have to really think about as we're leading, and guiding children in this day and age, is being more intentional with helping them with social skills and providing social opportunities for them to connect person to person. One thing about youth drug use is sometimes that is the way kids find to connect with other kids, because universally, I mean, you might not have a lot in common with someone, but if you're all using together, it's all good. You know, I mean, that's kind of their perspective. And I will tell you, I've worked for 2 different school systems. And so I'm not going to, I'll use a term, but it's been universal between both of those. But for example, youth would say, you know what, I never talked to any of these kids at school, but on the weekend I can go out to the ravine or the creek bed with them, and we all hang out, and, you know, I'm accepted at that point in time. But then we go back to school and they don't talk to me. So that is a great example of, you know, when kids are struggling to connect with a group, the last thing we want them to do is feel like they have to use substances in order to connect with a group. So, and to have like a social network. So our goal as, you know, caring adults is that we want to help youth develop the system or develop the ability to have, you know, positive pro-social connections with peers, devoid of alcohol or drug use. And, you know, for the most part, our children and our young people are mostly learning how to connect with others socially by watching us. And I think sometimes because media is such a distraction and is so ever present in our life, I'm not really sure that a lot of, especially younger children growing up, that they are necessarily paying much attention to us. I think they may be more absorbed in devices than even watching us. So, you know, the old thing we used to say, you know, is you learn by modeling the others around you, or modeling your parents. Is we are going to have to kind of hopefully restrict that device usage so that they can, you know, learn through modeling our behavior. And, you know, the other thing is sometimes some children really need more than just the modeling. Sometimes they really need us to teach them certain social skills. And more with more screen time and children having that, sometimes I'm having to say to young people, I need you to make eye contact with me. I need you to look at me. You know, I need you to give me your eyes. And I'll tell them why. I'll say it's because I need you to know that I'm paying attention to you, and I need to know that you're paying attention to me right now. And so that's why we do this. That's why we make that eye contact. You know, just encouraging them to have more awareness of others. One of the great things I get to do in my job is I get to work with a group of students that we call peer helpers. And they're trained in general helping skills. And one of the big skills we practice is listening, is just active listening. And so one thing that I have them do an activity, because I think many of our kids, our youth, struggle with actively attending to someone because they've got a phone nearby that's making noises. It's dinging, it's chirping, and they will abandon a conversation with a friend to attend to the phone. And so we do an activity where I actually kind of break it down. And so you have 2 people who are having a conversation. A person across the room interjects and talks to one of them with a random, totally not related to the conversation statement. And one person leaves their friend to go over and turn their back to them and just start talking to this other person that just interrupted. And I'm like, that's what it's like whenever you attend to your phone, when you're with someone and you're having a conversation and you're trying to listen to them, but your phone makes a noise and you stop paying attention to them and you start engaging with the person that's on that phone. You know, and you wouldn't do that in real life, but we do it all the time because of devices.
I tell my son sometimes, and I think it goes exactly to what you're saying. It's very easy to hear somebody because you're hearing them, but you're not listening. And as I tell him sometimes, I said, there is a very distinct difference between the 2 things. Yes, you're hearing me, but can you repeat back anything that I just said or understand what I just said? So I
yes.
think we're falling into, oh, I hear you, but I'm not listening. Or sometimes how you respond to an instant message or a text, to respond without thinking about what you're saying or putting much thought. It just, let me mark that off the list. So I know I've had that conversation with my son about paying attention and listening to really being engaged in the moment with who you're with and setting that phone aside.
And that's a great, in your life, you've had a real life experience where you've been able to provide some coaching and some skill development on how do you connect and engage socially appropriately. How do you get better at that? Because what you're teaching him is you're teaching him active listening. You're saying not just passive listening, but active listening, where you're reflecting back what I heard you just say. And you understood it. And that way you have a mutual agreement between the two of you then. And so at that point, the conversation is very meaningful because you gave a message, he understood it, he reflected back that he understood it. But we really do have to practice that. Those are things that we have to practice with young people in order for them to develop those skills, because those skills are what will help them connect in those positive pro-social relationships, which is a huge protective factor for our young people, not only for drugs and alcohol, but for a lot of other risky behaviors like we talked about in the very beginning. Even in going back to even other things that we need to teach them, other skills, is that, socially we are going to have conflict. Whenever we're in friendships and relationships, there's going to be conflict. It's really important that we actually talk to our children about how to practice healthy conflict resolution. That helps keep them in their friend group. It helps keep them connected that way. Even some young people, sometimes we have to, let them practice introducing themselves to new people. With our peer helpers, that is one of the skills that they're trained in, is how to introduce yourself. And they have like a little acronym that they use to help, that is a conversation starter tool. Because you can't help others if you can't even introduce yourself and get that started, but that's every child can benefit from those kind of things, learning those kind of skills. So the social skills to help them connect in a positive way, we just have to be intentional with that. And part of that intentionality also includes dealing with the distractions. And then, the third broad category of why youth use is really just that they're growing up in a culture that glamorizes use, drug and alcohol use. It makes young people feel like it's just normal. It's fun. Everybody does it. All of these people that I follow on TikTok do it. These people that YouTubers that I follow, they all do it. It just looks like they're having fun. It's a good time. So as parents and other caring adults, we really have to, look at those situations and then have that reality conversation with them. Do you think whenever, he was drinking and driving and high and he hit someone, I mean, just because he didn't go to jail does not mean there's going to be long-term effects from this, because we've all heard of these celebrities who do things and get in trouble. I'm thinking about Justin Bieber is the one I'm actually thinking of, because I had that conversation with my daughter when that happened. She was a big Justin Bieber fan, and I was like, yeah, but he hit someone with his car while he was under the influence. And, even although we never heard that he served any time, maybe he did, maybe he didn't, I didn't know and she didn't either. I just said, think about, he's got to deal with that for the rest of his life. That's something that will carry with him. So sometimes our job as those adults, the adult role, is that we have to flip the script on that culture that glamorizes use, and be able to say, you know what, but look at the flip side of this. Look at how many times that person's been married. Look at how many relationships that person's been in. It's really been a struggle for him or her to have a healthy relationship that's lasting. Don't you know that really has to hurt them? That has to be a really painful existence, so we really have to flip the script on that.
As we have talked about what is prevention and just kind of why youth are using substances, before we delve into some other aspects of prevention, do you have a key piece of advice or a key takeaway you would like to share with our listeners about what we have discussed so far?
Yes, I would say we need to keep in mind that prevention is something that really requires our effort and our attention. Mainly because most of us have seen people who have really struggled with addiction. We see adults that struggle with it and struggle with it for years and years, and it's just devastating. And one thing that just always resonates to me is that addiction really is a pediatrically acquired disorder. And the reason why I say that is because 90% of adults who struggle with addiction report that their use began before the age of 18. So the onset for this was actually much younger than when they began to get treatment or when they, kind of the wheels started coming off of the cart, And, we know that we know a lot about brain development that we never knew before. And now we know that the brain is not fully developed until the mid-20s, which is kind of tough because we look at teens and we go, well, they look all grown up on the outside for the most part. But in reality, there's a lot that's still happening in their brain, and drugs and alcohol can hijack that normal development so easily, and they can hijack, the pleasure centers and the reward centers. We have to start earlier. In fact, I would say really much, much earlier.
So to that point, when does prevention begin?
Well, whenever we reflect back on those three broad reasons why youth use substances, it's to deal with difficult emotions, to fit in socially and connect with others, and then, just the general culture that glamorizes it. So that tells us that we really, at least on the top two, emotions and social competencies, is we really do need to focus on social and emotional competencies in children beginning at birth. That's something that really just goes on, and we add new skills and things, and coping skills are introduced as it's developmentally appropriate. We just keep adding on year after year. We just have to kind of be pretty deliberate with that, and think about having those conversations and think about limiting distractions so that we can help children learn those coping skills and learn those social strategies and stuff. And I would say by mid to late elementary school, that's whenever you want to start having some substance specific conversations. And for some families, that has to start a lot earlier. Every child's situation is different. Some young people are growing up in environments where, there are people in their family that are truly struggling with addiction. Perhaps they're in treatment, perhaps they're just in long-term recovery, whatever that might be. Sometimes you need to start earlier and just make sure the conversations are age appropriate. But typically, I would say in late elementary school is about when you would start talking specifically about substances. I think for my family, the first conversation we ever had, I have two daughters, and the first conversation we ever had was about cigarettes. And it just kind of happened very organically. We were going into a restaurant. They were 3 and 5 years old, and they got ahead of me. And I noticed they stopped on the sidewalk and were staring down at the ground at something very intently and having this conversation. And as I approached, it was a cigarette butt that someone had thrown down, and they had not, crushed it out. So it was still burning and still giving off smoke. And they were trying to figure out what it was. So when I got there, they were like, "Mom, I think it might be on fire. It's smoking," but they couldn't figure out what is it. And so that was a great time. That was our very first, time to talk about tobacco and cigarettes and how bad that was for them. But now fast forward, just this fall, we were in a shopping mall, shopping for clothes. And at this point, I've got a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old, so different age. And we had a person walked by us, a young man, probably high school age. And I promise you, I've worked with youth for a long time. I don't think I have ever had such a lingering, strong smell of weed in my life. And they noticed it, both of them. And, right now, to your listeners, that was even during COVID. So, we were pretty socially distanced. And wearing masks. So for us to be able to smell it that strongly, it was really strong. And in addition to that, that really strong skunk smell, in addition to that, he was a mess. I mean, just
Oh,
appearance-wise, I had never seen anyone's eyes look so bloodshot ever, ever. And they noticed it, and they noticed just how his look of, he was just a mess. That's the best way I can
the
describe it.
devil
And they were like,
oh,
yeah. They asked me, they said, "Mom, what's wrong? And what is that smell?" So it was a great time, with two girls to talk about, yeah, if you smoke weed, that's what you're going to smell like. Um, and so, yeah, you go with the low hanging fruit, right? So you look at the vanity, of this is going to be problematic for them. So good, see, you'll stink. So you don't want to smoke weed because you'll stink. But, then I was also able to talk about, you also noticed his appearance, you noticed how slow he was reacting. Um, think of all the things you couldn't do if you were under the influence like he is right now.
do you
Um,
think there will be another facet to this as more and more states legislate recreational use of marijuana? You know,
oh,
is that going to play into this? Because if they're now saying it's legal, and whereas we know the effects that it can have, do you think that will be something that, while maybe not legal here in our state at this time, but as these things start evolving and changing, that will be something to have to add to the conversation with our youth, as that may be on the horizon?
Oh, yes. That is a conversation that we need to be having right now, particularly with the fact that with marijuana, and most states start their legalization process by legalizing it as, and I'm going to use air quotes around this, medical marijuana. So you can't see me, but imagine those air quotes, okay? Um, Here's the thing. Whenever we say anything is medicine, what do young people think that means? Safe, healthy, good for you. It's going to make you better. There is nothing about, and I will say THC. I'll stop using the term marijuana and use the term THC. There is nothing beneficial about that for children. There could be some discussion about that for adults, perhaps, but I still think anytime we take anything out from under the purview of the FDA, we're not doing our children any favors, or probably really society any favors. But, that part's separate. Children and their exposure to THC, there have been numerous studies over and over about how dangerous that is for them and how harmful it is, from their risk of addiction, which is much greater. And by the way, your listeners will know this is a diagnostic criteria. There is a diagnostic standard in the DSM-5 that we're using. So when people say things like, "Oh, it's not addictive," yeah, it is. It's not medicine for children. I mean, smoking weed or using other products, that's not medicine for children. Um, CBD is a whole different part of the marijuana plant. That would be things like Epidiolex, which is a FDA regulated drug, but kids can't understand that distinction between THC and CBD. So it's up to us as the adults in their life to help them understand that distinction, because with legalization comes the acceptance of it. If it's legal, it must be safe. If it's legal, it must be okay. And even in states where it is legal for recreational use, it is not legal for, anyone under the age of 21.
I just know that that's something, because I hear a lot of teenagers say, "Oh, well, if it's legal," just to your point exactly, that, "Oh, well, it's got to be okay," or they're coming around to saying that it's not so harmful. But as you've just clearly explained, there are so many different things to consider, and it's not just a simple yes or no. So thank you for
That
kind of elaborating on that. That I think that's a really important distinction to make.
Well, and Jennifer, I think there could be a whole separate podcast just on marijuana, really. And so that it's a really complex issue, because truthfully, it starts with legalization, but probably more problematic than that is the commercialization that follows afterwards. And if you, have traveled to Colorado or any of the other states that have full legalization, you'll see the billboards, the newspaper ads, the magazine ads. it's a commercialization that we've already told, industries like the alcohol industry, you can't advertise in certain places that are, that have youth audiences. We've done that with the tobacco industry too. But right now with the marijuana industry, there are no such restrictions on that. So the commercialization really creates such societal problems. And I would offer some caution to people who are reading surveys, that talk about youth use in legal states compared to non-legal states and stuff, because some of the surveys will ask about, are you smoking marijuana? And what we have seen is if you just look at that data point, that's going down in legal states. But then there's another question on those surveys that say, are you using a marijuana concentrate? Youth using that is going up dramatically. So, you have to be aware of because the industry is very good at spinning some of the data to make it look like legalization is not increasing youth use. In fact, it is. It's just pushing them to use substances that are much more potent, because marijuana concentrates typically are, have a THC concentration rate that can be anywhere from 60% to some even advertise up to 99% THC. So super high, super harmful. We know through a lot of the studies that have been done that, marijuana impacts children's ability to learn. One study out of, I think it was New Zealand, I believe, or I'm not sure, somewhere like that, looked at, or found that there was a 6 to 8% decline in IQ points from youth that were regular and persistent users. So, that wasn't your once a month user, that was regular and persistent use. But to lose 6 to 8 IQ percentage points is significant. I mean, if you're a absolute genius, you might not notice that. But, when you think about the average IQ is 100, if a child loses 6 to 8 points, you just fell below the norm level. You're in the lower curve there. So it's something we should all be really concerned about. And there is such a push for this. And it always seems to happen as, medical first and then full recreational second. And I think just as a society, we really need to look into that a little bit more carefully, because I don't believe it's healthy for our children. And it's already affecting them even right now, even in our state of Alabama, where it's not legal right now. Because it's legal in other states, it's already caused them to perceive it as not as harmful, not as risky, no big deal. And even parents say that. I mean, I have parents who will say, well, I'm glad it's just smoking some weed and not doing heroin, So part of what we can also do, I think, as adults is acknowledge the fact that all substances have a risk profile, especially when we're talking about youth. They all would, if you think about nicotine, I mean, tobacco kills more people than heroin ever has. But, we tend to react differently to those two substances, as a society. And it's because you don't smoke one cigarette doesn't kill you, right? It's a lifetime of use because of addiction that ultimately has that negative impact. So we have to just stop saying, well, I think we stop saying that this drug is okay because it won't kill you right away. This drug you should never take because it does have the potential to kill you immediately. We need to instead teach kids to think about harm on a continuum, and that every substance has its own unique harm, profile for you, and just be honest with them about what that is. And I would say, whenever youth are around that, middle elementary age, that's whenever we start talking about, how different things can hurt you, how it can impact you, and be honest. To say if you smoke a cigarette, you're going to die. If you, use marijuana, you're going to die. I think exaggerating doesn't help our point. We have to be really honest with young people and with young people that we care about. The other thing I think we do is around middle school, as the parents or caring adults, we really need to start teaching refusal skills and letting young people practice that, because the last thing we want to do is for them to be in a tough, difficult situation and having never had them practice how to get out of it.
That peer
So
pressure.
practicing,
Absolutely.
yes, practicing what you would say, what you would do in certain situations. And then the other thing is also, it's a great idea to make a safety plan with young people, to say, you know what, I know you might not want to text me and say, hey, I need you to come get me, because your friends might see that on your phone. But you know what, you can always just text me an X or whatever you agree upon, and I'm going to immediately call you and tell you there's been an emergency and I'm going to come pick you up. So have some sort of safety plan, so that if the situation is bad and they need to get out of it, just come up with a way of doing that, covertly, so that their friends don't realize what's going on. And the other thing is, just remember, this is not like a one and done kind of thing. Prevention is not, we talk about it once and we're done with it. We would never think, oh, we're going to offer a math lesson one time and now math for the rest of your life. We don't do that. We do this, it has to be repeated regularly. It has to be reinforced regularly. It has to change and scaffold as young people get older. So we have to, just be intentional with that.
As we look at developing these plans and talking to our youth, is there a way that we can advocate for them, or any advocacy advice, or could you talk a little bit about that? How can we, as the caring adults, as you say, in our youth's lives, what can we do? How can we help them?
I love that you use the term advocacy and being an advocate. Yes, we need to be advocate for children in, personal relationships. And for example, as parents, we can support each other as other parents, so supporting other parents and advocating for them and saying, yeah, you're doing the right thing. I know it's hard and it's tough, and, saying no and setting, boundaries is tough, but you got this, you're doing the right thing. So being an advocate from that perspective, to even being an advocate for, local policies that are pro-social and positive for children, to, state policies and national policies. So there's so many levels of where we can be an advocate for young people. Children need education. We need to advocate for prevention education. They need direction and supervision. And like I said, they need that consequence enforcement. So we need to be kind of that cheerleader and that advocate for parents and people and other, adults that are working with youth to do those things. They need the adults in their life to help them make good choices. And I always think about a story that I have of my pediatrician, he's just continues to be such a good advocate and encourager of me as a parent. He taught me a really great lesson very early on, whenever I had a daughter that was kind of in that terrible 2s to 3s that I think lasted until 5, somewhere in there. And he told, I can't even remember the exact, details of what she was doing, but there were several times where I was trying to take things away from her or not let her do things. And it was like her, she's very headstrong, and it was tough. And he finally just said to me, he said, you know what? He said, you're the mom. He said, and I know this is hard. He said, but she's too young to know what is in her best interest. You do, and it's your job. And he told me then, and he said, and this won't be the first time. He said, you're gonna experience this ongoing. He said, because even as a teenager, they think they know everything, but they still don't know what's in their best interest, but you do. And so that has stuck with me, and I've shared it with a lot of other parents, because that's sometimes what we need, is we need that other person in our life that is our peer, that's willing to say, you got this. I know it's hard, but you're doing the right thing, and you got this, keep with it. So I think there's so many ways that we can be those advocates for children. obviously the other thing in being an advocate would be, being aware of like, current drug trends that are out there, and knowing, for example, like with marijuana and THC and legalization and even with vaping and what's going on there, we do need to really work toward being advocates at a greater level than the family unit, looking at community advocacy opportunities and also statewide advocacy opportunities.
Speaking of trends and what is happening, drug trends and it doesn't have the same look that it might have perhaps when I was in high school versus what my son is seeing or what your daughters are seeing now. It is changing. What are some things in your opinion that as adults that we should be familiar with in terms of use? And also, are there behavioral trends, signs that we should be aware of as the face of substance use is changing?
Yes, I would say two particular substances that have changed dramatically that as adults we might not always recognize when youth are using. And I'll start with vaping. Vaping is one of the big ones. And so, we had seen youth tobacco use decline to historic lows. I never really thought we would ever achieve that. And then around 2000, I believe it was around 2006, 2008, electronic cigarettes came on the market, and they were invented. And so before we knew it, we were starting to see some young people that were using nicotine in vape devices. And then we kind of hit around 2016, and it was like it just blew up with the number of youth that were using, and that was mainly because of Juul. Juul was able to come out with a product that was really sleek. You kind of think of it as like the iPhone of vaping. They had a great marketing strategy. It was rechargeable. It could plug in. It can plug in with a USB plug into a computer, laptop, or other, charging area. And it looks like it's a USB port. I mean, not a port, a jump drive. That's what it looks like. And so parents did not know what they were seeing. In some cases, educators, we didn't know what we were seeing at first. If you've never held a Juul or held one of the electronic devices like that, vaping devices, I'd really recommend you try one out because literally they can be palmed so easily, you can't see it. It produces very little vapor. And I will say, instead of vapor, I'm going to call it an aerosol because that's more legitimately what that is. It's an aerosol. So think hairspray. Because it's not harmless water vapor at all. But it's so discreet. And not only that, but we had, as a society, as a culture, we had said you're not going to be allowed, to put flavorings in tobacco anymore. You can't have anything. They were still allowing menthol, but they no longer allowed the other flavorings in tobacco products. But now vaping's on the scene, and there's all these amazing candy flavors out there for the liquid. So we're now, making it even far more appealing to young people. And so that is something I would just say you really almost have to stay really on top of that as a parent, as another caring adult, is to know what's happening in the trends of that industry, of the vape industry, because it's very, very hard to detect. It's hard to know what to look for. And now we have these vaping devices that are not pod-based anymore. Like the Juul is a pod-based where you have to take the pod in and out, and it's got the nicotine. So once you use all of it, you throw it away. And their pods have different strengths. So some of them have the same nicotine content as a pack of cigarettes. Some of them more like 2 packs. So the FDA came in and said, hey, you know what? We're not going to allow flavors, different flavors in pods. So they regulated that, and I think they do still allow mint. They still would allow mint. So that kind of cut into Juul's profit there whenever they took out the flavors, and cut into a lot of others' profit too. So then the next thing we saw emerge on the scene was disposable items. So these are no longer, they're now exempt from the rules about, the pod-based systems because it's disposable. It doesn't use a replaceable pod. So now we're seeing those everywhere in all kind of candy flavors. I mean, it would just amaze you if you went online and started searching for those, and they're cheap. I mean, I have seen them as cheap as 99 cents for a starter pack, which
Wow.
is the equivalent of a pack of cigarettes.
Absolutely.
You can find them $5.99, $2.99, and we really are talking about nicotine content that is equivalent to a pack of cigarettes. So that is a trend that's out there that, I think it caught a lot of us adults off guard because it's so discreet. It's so easy to hide. Think if you ever smoked in the bathroom at school, if you graduated in the 1980s or 90s, you were going to get caught. I mean, you know, but now you can vape in a bathroom at school and no one will ever catch you. It's just incredibly discreet. So it is encouraging heavy use. It's encouraging youth use, but it's also encouraging heavy use like we have not seen in terms of nicotine. And historically, actually, we've never had this many youth using nicotine since we started even surveying. So we're looking at a 50-year high on this. And then the other substance I would say that is so dramatically different than it was in the 1980s, 90s, and even early 2000s is marijuana or THC. Reflect back on when we first learned about crack, which is, concentrated cocaine. And it was, it devastated communities back in the 1980s. I mean, we were all talking about it. Even in sentencing, you got a much greater sentence if you got caught with crack versus cocaine and stuff. So, I mean, we were really worried about crack. Well, now we have THC concentrates that they kind of refer to as, in fact, there is a crystalline version of THC that is extracted from the marijuana plant. So, we are talking about concentrates like crystalline, distilled, things they call waxes, butters, hash oil. All of those things have incredibly high THC content. And just to give you an analysis, I mean, strict bud, if you're talking about rolling a joint or, anything like that, you're looking at, talking about the organic product. You're looking at about 15% THC now, which, by the way, even in the early 90s and 80s, the THC content was more around 3%. So even when we're talking about plant material, we're still talking about a 3% to 15% THC content change. So it's a much, much stronger plant, much, much higher concentration of THC. And throw on top of that they've learned how to extract the THC and make these concentrates that are just almost pure THC is so concerning. In legal places, states like Colorado, I always use them as the example because they've kind of been the forerunner in this. They have increases in emergency room visits because of psychosis that is induced by, the using the concentrates, the dabs, the butters, the hash oil, that kind of stuff. And they're also seeing this hypermesis, and I probably am saying that wrong, but it's basically that, vomiting and incredible abdominal pain. And the only thing that can really help people with that is just to stop using THC. They have to get it out of their system. So the emergency rooms are seeing a lot of concerning stuff as a result of marijuana, but as a result of the change in marijuana and how young people are using it. I would not now, in this day and age, I would probably not tell parents to be on the lookout for rolling papers and, something that looks like grass in their kid's backpack or drawer or something. I would say be aware of vape devices, be aware of, like the Carmex little white tubed little dispenser thing that's got the yellow top, yellow lid, because they'll put stuff in there because it looks just like Carmex. I mean, the wax does. So they'll, take that out and put it in there. in terms of smell, there's no smell associated with concentrates. That's why youth are using it so much. They can use it anytime, any place, anywhere, and you're not going to be able to smell it. They can be using it in their bedroom, and you wouldn't know it. And think about that. Any of our audience that is familiar with weed from the 1980s or 90s, your parents would have known if you were
No.
smoking it in your room. That's not the case anymore. So it's really hard for parents right now because those are two substances that I would say have changed so much, and they're so discreet now. They have products that are so discreet now that it's just almost impossible. I mentioned vaping, and there are actually, vaping cartridges like Juul cartridges that are THC. So it's hash oil, but just in a tiny little cartridge that they plug in, and parents wouldn't know.
And parents will have no idea what's happening.
Yes. And, and even with helping parents know what kind of behaviors to look for when their young person is using substances, even that's changed a little bit over the years from whenever I first started working in prevention. I used to always say one of the best ways you would know if your child is using substances would be look at their grades. If their grades start falling, you really need to at least consider that. And now, that's really not a great indicator. I mean, definitely if their grades are falling, something could be happening. But we have a lot of young people that are still achieving at a high level. They're keeping their grades up, but yet they're smoking weed a lot, they're drinking a lot, but they're still keeping the wheels on. My concern would be is they're able to manage it right now, because if you think about in a young person's life, so many of their survival needs are being met by parents. It's whenever they hit the point of having to be out on their own, and now they've got work, plus they have to meet their own, survival needs have to be met, all those, responsible things you have to do as an adult. That's a lot of times when you see the wheels come off and you realize, whoa, there actually is an addiction here. And they're not going to be able to be successful in life until we get them help, until we get them into recovery. Other things I would say for parents to look for as far as behaviors is to always look if there's a significant change in their friend group. Especially if they completely abandon one friend group for a new one. And particularly if that new friend group is, they don't want to tell you who they are. They don't want you to meet the other person's parents. It's almost a little secretive. Or I know them, we're friends online, but we want to meet up at, these different places. Those are all huge red flags for parents. So watch out about the change in friend group or developing a new friend group that they don't want you to know a lot about. And then also withdrawing. Now, as with any, talking about youth, it's so hard to figure out what is normal development versus what is concerning. And so what I would say, it's perfectly normal that a teenager would start to withdraw from their parents. That's totally normal. But they should be, if that's happening, what would be normal is it would look like, well, I'm withdrawing from my parents a little bit and I don't want to listen to you as much as I used to. I'm going to hang out with my friends a lot more. And what they think is more important to me than really what you think right now. That would be kind of normal. But withdrawing and not, gravitating to your friend group more and just isolating yourself, a young person that's doing that, I would be real worried about at that point. Like I said, sometimes it's really hard to know what's normal versus what's abnormal, but just know if they do start pulling away a little in adolescence, that, eventually they're going to launch and be on their own. So that's perfectly normal that they start hanging out with their friends more and stuff. But if they're just withdrawing and not substituting it with anything else, an example might be a child who's always participated in some, activity, and they stop participating in the activity, but they don't replace it with another interest. Then their withdrawal from that activity could be because they want to spend more time getting high or drinking. So just, kind of be aware of behaviors. I think as adults, we have to watch that to see if there's any behaviors that just might be something that we need to check into. It's like, let me see what's going on here.
And keep the lines of communication open, and just let our children know that we are there. I know that's kind of what I've done as a mom. Just, I try not to private check in with Emerson and make sure he's comfortable with what he's willing to share, or if there is an adult in his life, that may not be me, that he might feel more comfortable talking to about things just in general.
Yes, it is always good.
Advice you might give parents, as they navigate this with children, or, just children in their community or in their lives? Any advice or words you could share about that?
I would just really support what you just said about being there for them, regardless of what your relationship is with a young person. Really just being present and accepting and letting them talk and share. Sometimes that's easier if that is, sometimes that's hard, I guess I should say. Sometimes that's hard if that's your child, because, our emotions can get really close to the surface. We can get really scared all of a sudden. We can get mad easily. So sometimes it goes from like, I'm scared, and that switch gets flipped very quickly, and we're angry because we really started out scared for what they're doing or saying. So, doing your best as the caring adult to avoid being there for them, listening, unconditional acceptance, and then that trying your very best to avoid overreacting to what's going on. And that doesn't mean that there aren't consequences if rules have been broken, but, to calmly enforce those rules and to calmly be present with them, to listen to and listen to the why. Give them that space to share what's going on and why maybe they're making some choices that they're making, or why they're worried about something. And sometimes, that it's really, really hard for me because I like to give advice and fix things. I'm very analytical and logical, and I have to really work on that, even when I'm working with students, is to sometimes just be present and not worry about fixing it, but just listening. It's not an easy thing, and it's certainly not an easy thing when you feel like there's a crisis. Great example is if your child or the young person you're caring for, calls you and says, I need you to come pick me up, or they text you, I'm in a bad situation, come get me. You pick them up and they've been drinking, or they smell like weed, or whatever, is to honor that. I'm not going to ask you questions right now. I'm going to just listen to you. But then tomorrow when you get up, we got to have a conversation, So sometimes that can be really, really tough because we get very emotionally, distraught in those situations too. So the calmer you can be, and that's where, parents supporting each other, other adults, healthcare professionals supporting parents with just saying, you've got this, you're doing the right thing. You're going to be able to handle it. And so that we all need that. We need that support.
Absolutely. And I know that you just kind of touched on healthcare. My son's pediatrician was always someone, as Emerson was growing up, and we'd have things, whatever his pediatrician said, Emerson thought was, the most wonderful thing. And so to have, someone else who has your best interest, but isn't mom and dad, who might be seen as nagging or interfering and everything. It was just really kind of interesting. But whenever Emerson would go to the doctor, whether for well child or sick or whatever, his doctor would always make time to just discuss things with him. Mom, if you don't mind just kind of stepping out for a minute, and just they would have, maybe 5 minutes, if that, just to kind of talk. And Emerson could say things that, were maybe on his mind that maybe he had talked to me about, or maybe he didn't feel comfortable about. And I always thought the world of his pediatrician for doing that. It was an outlet for him and a resource that I wouldn't necessarily have thought of.
Totally. And that's been my experience too. In fact, my pediatrician even lets me ahead of time call in,
Mm-hmm.
and the nurse will put a note in the file of things I need him to say or ask. Because
What a
you're absolutely
wonderful,
right.
yeah,
Sometimes children need for information to come from another source, a respected, trusted source, or a conversation to happen that's generated by, that
absolutely.
gets started by someone else. So yes, he made that offer very early on. And so, I have on a few occasions taken him up on that, where I have, called and given him a note ahead of time, so that as he opens the file, he notices it,
Mm-hmm.
and then, he takes it from there. And
This is
really, there are just a lot of ways. Whenever I think about it, there are so many ways that the medical community can help promote prevention and positive behavioral development, and do that already. I mean, with what they're naturally doing. Helping parents and educating them is certainly one of them that we've talked about, and you and I both have experience with that. And I would just encourage thinking about, every community's different, and but think about it like a child being the center of an onion, that core part. There are multiple layers around them, and there's multiple layers where we can have an impact. Like the first layer would probably be the parents and the close family friends, that close network right there. But then the next layer is, might be the church or the school or youth programs and stuff. And then the outside would be the larger community and city and then state. So all along the way, you can kind of, imagine there's opportunities for healthcare professionals to be involved in, helping families and helping children, and being involved in prevention strategies at every level. Certainly, we've talked about some of the pro-health policies that impact children that, the healthcare community could be involved in. I mean, I do think about, the marijuana issue is one thing. I know that is a policy that our state, that the state of Alabama is going to be faced with this year. But also, we continue to really fight against the vape industry. They kind of, I hate to say, I don't know how to say this, but they sort of pulled the wool over a legislator's eye in 2013 and got him to sign off on a bill that was passed that made electronic nicotine products, they weren't even considered tobacco products. It said, we're not going to consider them tobacco products. We're not going to regulate them. These are cessation devices. So I didn't learn about that there was this bill out there. I couldn't understand why no one was enforcing vaping and selling to minors and stuff. And so
Knowing that
then
that was
found
the
out
play. Oh.
Right. So I found out about that. And so a group of prevention people around the state in 2018 were able to get a bill passed that now at least defines electronic nicotine products as tobacco products. But we still have so far to go on this, because first of all, a vendor does not, if I want to sell tobacco products, I don't even have to pay a vendor license. So there's nothing for the ABC board to take away. Even if I'm selling to
Wow.
minors, there's nothing for them to take away from me, because I didn't pay for it to begin with, which is totally untrue whenever you look at alcohol. I mean, they have to pay multiple licensing fees for alcohol in the state of Alabama. The other thing is there's no tax on electronic nicotine products. That's why they can sometimes be cheaper than a pack of cigarettes. So that's a concern, and it should be a concern, because we're going to see a lot of health care issues that as a society we're going to pay for from the electronic vaping industry, and we're not taxing them on any of this. So there's all of that. There's, product placement concerns that are policy issues that could be addressed. If you ever walk in a convenience store, which I rarely do now, and I rarely let my children go in a convenience store, because you've got that huge wall back there with, I mean, it is unreal how many tobacco products there are behind the wall. And it's right at the checkout counter, like you can't avoid it. So there are just innumerable ways that the healthcare community can engage in, in advocacy around safeguards on those issues. And even with alcohol, we in the state of Alabama, we are what they refer to as a controlled state, meaning Alabama, the state, actually controls the sale of alcohol. And that's not necessarily true in all other states. It is what the CDC recommends. The CDC recommends that states be control states the way Alabama is. But there is a push right now to privatize that, which would mean the alcohol industry would regulate themselves in the state. That does not sound like a good idea to me, and especially whenever the CDC tells us that's not a good idea. But of course we see that all the time. With the CDC tells us one thing and we're doing the opposite, because the CDC also says, marijuana use is not good for you and vaping is not good for you, but yet we still see this. It's rampant in our, especially among our youth, and they're a target audience, unfortunately.
This has been such an enlightening, surprising in a lot of ways, and very, very informative discussion. And I want to thank you for your time today. Before we end the conversation, is there a pearl of wisdom or a key message that you would like to share with our listeners as it relates to prevention and our youth? Just something that we can take with us as we navigate these largely uncharted waters.
I wish I had a pearl of wisdom. Actually, I wish I had a magic wand. If I'm wishing, I'm going to wish for a magic wand so that we can fix this. Because honestly, I have seen much more than my fair share of youth struggle and families struggle with addiction. And I guess, like I said, it's no pearl of wisdom, but I would just say prevention needs to matter. It needs to have a greater focus in our society. I think we're much more likely to treat the problem and focus on that as opposed to preventing it. The other thing I would just say is let's also remember that most youth make good choices. And sometimes I think we forget about that. I think we need to really support those young people in positive pro-social decisions that they're making. And I have to remind young people all the time, because they have a tendency to think in terms of extremes. And they'll say, everybody uses, everybody drinks, everybody smokes weed. And I'm like, well, no, actually, if you look at our surveys, these very, valid, good surveys, most kids are making good choices. So really, you're in the majority. You may feel like you're the only one not doing it, but really, you're the most. I mean, you're in the majority. The thing is, we just tend, as a society, we talk about the sensational things. We talk about the negative, and sometimes forget to really focus on all the good choices that young people are making. So I think that maybe, we're approaching January, so maybe that's going to be my New Year's resolution, is to be more positive and continually remember all the good decisions kids are making every day.
That is wonderful, wonderful parting words. And again, thank you for joining us today. We really do appreciate your time.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you for listening, and stay tuned for more Physicians in Training podcasts. To view all of SMA's podcasts, visit sma.org/podcasts.